Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
I could barely work at all today thinking about some stories I heard recently. One about an ex-coworker who doesn't take no for an answer. Another about a doppelganger on the night shift. And even one about a drive home gone horribly wrong. But it could have ended worse. Yikes, scary stuff. But now that I'm on my break, I can relax and share these stories with you. Grab a coffee, decaf is fine, and enjoy these tales from the break room. Trucker Serial Killer. From Anonymous. Two of my older sisters used to work as in-home caregivers to an elderly lady. My oldest sister, we'll call her A, worked the evening shift until around 8 p.m. At this time, my other sister, C, would arrive and work the overnight shift until the next morning. One night, A sat around chatting with C after her shift until it was very late. At around 10:30 p.m., she said her goodbyes and headed home. As she was leaving, she asked C to call her husband and let him know she just left because her car was acting up and she was concerned it might break down on her way home. On that night, her husband and their children were camping out in the backyard. They'd set up a tent and planned to sleep outside. So nobody was inside to answer the phone, and by the time A had headed home, they were all in fact already asleep. As A had feared, her car did indeed break down on the interstate between the town where she worked and the next town over, which is where she lived. She sat in her vehicle trying not to feel panicked. She had no cell phone at the time. She was sure that C had gotten a hold of her husband and that he would soon realize she must have broke down and would come looking for her. So she waited. After an hour or more had passed, she became worried. She only lived about half an hour away. If her husband was coming, he should have arrived by now. It was then that she noticed an 18-wheeler pulling up in front of her car. The driver got out and walked over to her vehicle, tapping at her driver's side window. She cracked the window just enough to speak, and he asked if she was okay. She replied that she was, and that her husband would soon be here to get her. He smiled at her and told her he knew she'd been sitting here for a while because he had passed by earlier on his way to make a delivery in the town where she worked. He said he'd told himself he was going to stop and check on the stranded vehicle if it was still there on his way back through. This put her at ease with him, so she rolled the window down farther to thank him and to reassure him that her husband would in fact be there soon. He argued that he couldn't just leave her there though. To do so would make him feel terrible, and he'd worry about her safety. He told her he didn't have a phone but pleaded with her to allow him to drop her off at the 24-hour gas station at the next exit. At least that way she'd be in a safe place, and she'd be able to use their phone to call someone. This was the exit she was heading to anyway, and she didn't feel like he was a threat. She thought, why not? It's better than waiting out here alone. So she accepted his offer, gathering her purse and locking up her car before climbing into the passenger side of the big rig. The man pulled out and began driving down the highway. He made some small talk with A, asking her how many kids she had, etc., the usual stuff strangers chat about. While she was chatting, she noticed he was pulling the truck over to the shoulder. They'd only gone a little over a mile. She could still faintly see her own vehicle in the side mirror. Alarmed, she asked what was going on. The driver brought the truck to a stop and left the engine idling. He stared straight ahead at the windshield and began talking, but his voice and demeanor had changed drastically. A suddenly felt that she had made a terrible decision to trust this man and that she was going to pay for it. He then said, "Your husband really isn't coming, is he?" Before she could answer, he continued, "He doesn't care about you. Nobody does. He would have already been here if he cared about you. Or someone would have come by now and noticed you hadn't gotten home. Nobody's coming, are they? If your family cared about you, they'd make sure you had a good car that wouldn't break down and leave you stranded alone out here." A began to cry, telling him firmly that her husband was on the way and she was going to get out and walk back to her car. He warned her that wouldn't be wise, that she would get hit or otherwise injured in some way. She pleaded with him to let her get out of the truck. She promised him she wouldn't say anything about this to anyone if he'd just let her go. Still staring straight ahead, he asked another question of her. "Who raised you?" Confused and terrified, she answered that her mama had raised her. The man lifted his head and sighed, a heavy sigh. He then turned away and said, "Good answer. I had a mama who raised me too, and that's the only thing saving your life tonight." At this, he produced a cell phone and handed it to her. Before letting go, he said, "Call your husband, tell him to come get you, and do not call anyone else." She did as he instructed. The phone rang and rang multiple times. She was about to give up, terrified at what that might mean, when she heard her husband's sleepy voice answer the phone at last. She explained she had broken down on the road and he needed to come get her right away. He said it would be a bit because he'd need to collect his tools so he could check her car out when he got there. Her voice shaking, but trying not to upset the trucker, she managed to say, "I'm in a big truck with a man. I need you to come right now." Her husband began to question what she was talking about, as he was not understanding that she was in real danger. She reiterated to him that he needed to come now, that she could still see her car a ways back from where she was sitting in the semi-truck. The next several minutes passed by slowly and quietly, except for her own inner panic. The driver remained quiet, staring out the windshield. Suddenly, she could see a vehicle pulling up near her broke-down car in the distance. The driver saw it too and told her to get out and to go to her husband. She quickly opened the door, frantically trying to climb down from the truck, but falling down to the ground instead. She then began to run in the opposite direction toward her broke-down car and the safety of her husband's pickup. When she made it to her husband, she climbed in and demanded that he drive. The big truck ahead wasn't yet attempting to pull out. As they passed it, she didn't even want to look over and get a better look at the man or the truck. After they passed, the trucker pulled out behind them. She was soon relieved when she saw the familiar exit in sight, and he continued on past it as they took the exit instead. She tried telling her husband what had happened, but he was too concerned with scolding her for being foolish enough to enter a truck with a stranger. He half believed, or hoped, she was probably exaggerating and wasn't in any real danger. She began to feel like it was somehow her fault, and that no one would truly believe her. She never did report this to law enforcement, and only told a few trusted family members about it. To this day, I wonder if that man was a serial killer, and if he'd done this before, but others hadn't ended up as lucky as my sister. Encounter with a Demon from Conky Joe 89. I was 26 years old when this happened. This was not my first graveyard shift job, but it was the only one where I worked alone, and it will certainly be the last one I ever work. Now, I don't mind the location being shared, and honestly, I encourage the sharing of the locale, as I'm always interested in hearing stories from my home state of Texas, and I'm especially curious as to whether anyone else has experienced anything like this. Whether it be the particular thing I encountered, or whether just under similar circumstances. Let me just say up front, I was not under the influence of any drugs, nor had I been drinking. If I'm going to be 100% forthcoming, the reason I wound up living and working where I did was that I just completed a detox and subsequent residential stay in a drug treatment program. So funnily enough, you could say I was as sober as possible. Definitely not one of the better times in my life, but we live and learn, right? Anyway, enough of my background and babbling. On to what I saw. whatever it was. I worked the graveyard shift as the maintenance man at a huge retirement community located in the town of Temple, Texas, near the end of 2015. I clocked in at 7 p.m. and clocked out at 6 a.m. The old folks didn't have to be out of what I'll call the community building and back into their own individual apartments until 9 p.m. So there would be about a 2-hour window when I showed up where the community building would have a lot of friendly older people hanging around. They'd be playing cards, chatting, exercising, that type of stuff. Couldn't be a more warm and inviting vibe, honestly. And then, like clockwork, there would be a change in energy. I'll never forget when I first became aware of it, because every shift after that, as the clock crept closer to 9 p.m., an uneasy feeling of dread and anticipation would set in on me. It was so heavy and palpable. I knew that soon I'd be isolated in that huge and quiet building, all alone. Or at least it would appear that way. There was something going on in that building. There were windows lining the entirety of the building. They looked out onto the parking lot outside, and the building was set up in a sort of U-shape, or a horseshoe, so that from one hall you could look across the parking lot and see the other hallway that made up the other half of this U. I would constantly see someone, or something, walking along the corridors on whatever side of the building I wasn't on. It was just strange at first. I kept thinking, nah, surely it's just the blinds parted in a certain way, or no, it's just because I'm moving over here that it appears something over there is moving too. I was never successful in actually physically spotting this figure, even though on the majority of time I would see it and attempt to rush over. There was quite literally nowhere for anyone to hide or anywhere for them to go except back down the hall and past me. But I would never find anyone, only serving to further my suspicions that there was something very off going on within this place. Not necessarily anything evil or threatening, just off. Seeing as how this wasn't really a business establishment, it was more a set of communal buildings, as I said before. The employees, both daytime and nights graveyard duties, didn't really have a proper break room, as it were. So we would all use the refrigerator and the coffee prep station that was really meant for the older folks to utilize when they were having breakfast or getting snacks over the course of the day. I cannot count the number of times I'd feel like having a quick pick-me-up coffee, or maybe a complimentary carrot cake slice or 3, and when rounding the corner beside the coffee and the fridge area, a nurse from the hospice wing would either already be there or would also be rounding the corner from their side of the complex, scaring the absolute crap out of me. Just imagine it's been something like 5 or 6 hours into your shift and you haven't seen or heard a single person, voice, or anything, except that sort of phantom-like figure, the one you can never seem to truly locate. And suddenly, boom, there's someone not even 2 feet away from you, totally unexpected. Those nurses probably thought I was a very odd dude, given that every time they saw me, it would be me rounding a corner into the break area and almost having a sheer heart attack at the sight of them. Now, I'm absolutely certain I came off as the more than capable, competent, and unshakable overnight maintenance man that the community of older folks needed to keep their homes up and running all night without fail or issues arising. But as things tend to do over the weeks and months that followed, I grew accustomed to just expecting someone to be in that break area, at least once or twice over my long, dragging shift. So it eased my tensions, if only slightly. Well, that newfound sense of being able to let my guard down, and not constantly being a walking bundle of nerves, all came to an end one night when I was in what I called the dead end. Ironic, really. It was the side of the U where the hallway ended in an office, a gym room, and a physical therapy room. The other side of the U had a door that led to still more rooms and areas, so over there it felt, I don't know, less claustrophobic and isolated. But the dead end, it had an energy about it. You would always feel like something was at your back, watching, brooding. The worst part was having to run a vacuum down there, because you constantly felt the need to spin around and check your back, because you couldn't rely on sounds to alert you. Well, one day I was cleaning up the dead end. Other than that creepy feeling, it was going fairly normal. But then, something odd caught my eye. Through the window, out towards the rear parking lot, there was a dimly lit sidewalk lining the building that led around to a separate employee-only parking lot in the back. And leaning around the corner of that wall, just barely illuminated by the lamppost, which it was gripping and almost trying to conceal itself with, was a very tall, slender, half physical, half apparition, and very demonic-looking figure. This figure stood about 8 feet tall. Well, I say stood, but as you looked toward the feet, it just sort of faded away. It didn't become whole or solid looking until about the upper thigh, the lower waist area, where it was cloaked in a garment that was tattered and thin, open in the front, revealing emaciated looking ribs. Its arms were extremely long and thin, and it didn't seem to have 5 fingers on its hands. Instead, there were maybe 3 or 4. But it didn't have normal human hands. They were oversized, and where the fingers should have started, the flesh of this thing's hands seemed to sort of erupt into massive bone-like claws. I use the word erupt because where the claws jutted out from the hands, it's as if that flesh was newly injured, like it had just intentionally unsheathed these claws from within its hands. Yeah, think Wolverine from the X-Men type vibes. It was disgusting, and I'm pretty sure I could definitely see trickling streams of blood cascading from these claws onto the cement below. Perched atop a skinny neck was a skull-like head, sort of like cattle, but on top of its head were massive horns like a buck's. The thing simply stood there, watching me. I could feel its gaze bore into me. I was overwhelmed with nausea and dread. It sounded kind of extreme, but the only way I could describe it was that it felt like happiness was suddenly rendered a foreign concept to me. I felt as if I could never be happy again, like I had never actually been happy before. Just sad that I was leading a wasted life, that I would one day have a death that no one would mourn or even notice. It was like while I had my eyes on this thing, there was only me and it. Almost like for those few seconds, it and I stood outside of normal time or something. When I finally snapped to my senses, I literally ran away. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran my rear off. My heart was leaping into my throat. As I said before, as far as I know, all that thing did was stay there, creepily observing me. I assume it was watching me, even as I fled. From that day on, I started cleaning the dead end while there were still residents hanging about, so that hopefully I would never be put in that position again. I wouldn't last but probably a few more months at that place anyway. Then I was out of there. I'd had enough. I never did encounter that entity again, but that one time was more than enough for me. I was working in constant fear and anxiety that I would see it again, and I dreaded that the next time I saw it, it would be from a not-so-safe distance. What I saw there stuck with me. I definitely think that the fact that there was a hospice hallway on the opposite side of the same building, where we'd lose at least one person every couple of weeks or so, played a large part in attracting this entity to the location. Perhaps it was to feed on the negative energy associated with death or the dying, to feed off the feeling of hopelessness those poor people assuredly felt as they knew their life was slipping away from them. I often get unnerved even recanting this experience to anyone. This isn't the only paranormal experience I've had, far from it, but this was easily one of the most unsettling ones. The Pizza Restaurant. From Anonymous. I worked at a pizza restaurant for 6 years, my first ever job. The restaurant was practically in the middle of nowhere. I was the closing manager one night. I had to send all my coworkers home besides one. We'll call her Angie. At the time, it was about 20 minutes until closing, so I was in the dish pit and Angie was by the drive-thru window. A lady came in through the front door and went straight to the bathroom. Angie went over and waited at the front desk. She waited for about 10 minutes and then came to get me. I went over to knock on the bathroom door, asking if the lady inside needed help, and to tell her we had 10 minutes until closing. But the lady didn't come out, even after our closing time. So I called the manager over, and she told us to call the police. I went to the bathroom door and told the lady that if she didn't come out of the bathroom, then I would be calling the police. She finally came out and asked if one of us could drive her home. We told her that was against our policy. She went on to explain, "But you're the only ones here. No one would know." I pointed over to our surveillance system and told her that my manager was watching. I came up with the BS story on how the icon in the corner of the screen meant she was watching, but really it was just for recording purposes. She began to cry and told us she had no way home, that it was too cold outside to wait. We let her use the phone to call people to come get her, but no one was answering her calls. Mind you, it was 11 o'clock in the middle of nowhere, so most people were already in bed or wasted. This lady smelled as if she had just slept on the barroom floor and had done every drug under the sun. Finally, and politely, I asked her to leave the building because I had a family to get home to. She got extremely mad and began to threaten us. I'd finally had enough. I had Angie go to the back and call the cops. I told the woman what was going on, that the cops would be on their way. She was about to grab a chair when Angie came around the corner with one of our pizza knives and told her that if she touched the chair, she would throw it at her. That blade was an extremely sharp chunk of metal, and it was about 2 feet in length. The lady got scared and left. I hardly finished my closing shift and went home, scared and rattled. The following day, we found out she had crawled in the dumpster and stayed there for like 3 hours before trying to break into the storage shed. Sometimes you get the craziest customers. Close call in broad daylight. From Katie, D1230. I drive a newspaper round every night, 365 days a year, even Christmas. It's a pretty awesome gig, actually. I start at 1 a.m. and end around 5 a.m. daily. The only few times it really sucks is during snowstorms. My paper route is about half residential areas and half rural county roads. Sometimes there's a whole half mile between stops. It's dark, and obviously I've seen some things that have creeped me out, but this time was different. A snowstorm had hit overnight. The country half of my route was going to have to wait until the plows came out. I returned to finish my work after the roads were plowed. Now, as a quick side note, I'm used to working in the dark. When I come across someone outside, 9 out of 10 times they're drunk or drunkened up to no good. For this reason, I carry a taser with me and a wooden dowel rod in my truck when I deliver newspapers, shifting my weapon to under my arm when I have to deliver a paper on an elderly customer's porch. It makes me feel better. Anyway, it was 11:20 a.m. in broad daylight. The sun was blaring and blinding that day. Tons of folks were outside moving snow out of their driveways. I made my way out of town to the half of my route I needed to finish. I pulled up to a customer's house that I delivered to daily for about 2.5 years. Never one complaint. As I'm putting the newspaper in their mailbox, I look up to see an old man standing in the service door of his garage with the overhead door shut. I holler over to him, "Morning, want me to run your paper to you?" I didn't want him to slip and fall. For context, I'm a 30-year-old female, 5'3", so in my mind I was trying to help this man out so he didn't have to walk all the way through the snow that had fallen on his unplowed driveway. He smiled and nodded. As I jogged down his driveway, I speak again. "Some storm, huh? Here's your paper." And I smile warmly. This man then takes 2 steps backwards into his dark garage and says, "Come in here." And he smiles. I laugh nervously. "Oh, no thank you, I have your paper for you though," still advancing my hand out holding his newspaper. "Step in here, I have something to show you," he utters. It was at this moment I realized the fresh snow had swallowed up all sound around me. I was alone with this man, standing next to his dark garage with neither of my weapons. Why would I bring them? It was just an old man in the morning. My mind began racing. I'm sure he's about to lunge and pull me into his garage. I take a step back. He takes a step towards me. He asks, "What is your name?" Trying to remain polite, I responded, "Katie." "Katie what, pretty girl?" as he smiles creepily. Katie, your paper girl," I said as I looked around at my surroundings, keeping my guard up on the man and still holding the paper. There were trees and fields nearby. There was one neighbor about a football field away. He stated one last time, "I need to show you something. Step in here." My body screamed for me to bolt away. I replied, "No, I'm already late. Have a good day." I tossed the paper and ran up the driveway. I made it to my truck. He was still standing at the door, just looking at me. I began breathing heavy and sort of freaked out at the thoughts of what he wanted to show me. The whole ordeal lasted about 2 minutes, and I delivered to this house nightly still. Now I always pull up very slowly, rubbernecking all around before opening my door to deliver the paper. Nothing since. I can't be sure, but I could have sworn that as I was running away, I heard him whisper, "Damn." College Night Shift, from Eva Fan 33. I used to work part-time at the college where I studied. I took courses in the IT field, and each semester they would hire some students to work entry-level tech positions, granting decent income and great experience. Being one of the lucky few to get a job, I didn't complain when I was rostered over to the night shift. My role was a lab proctor. Usually I was tending to computer labs, re-imaging workstations, and installing new ones. The reason there was a night shift at all was to service the instructors teaching part-time courses. There were only a few night classes, sometimes none at all, but even so, if something went wrong, we had to be there. Otherwise, a class might end up canceled. I only had one partner in the evening hours, a girl named Kira. I was fresh out of high school and she was a few years older than me, but we got along well. Similar senses of humor and all that. Things were pretty seamless for the majority of the term, until we hit the first day of December. I'm going to recount it to the best of my ability. Hopefully you don't mind the details, but I want to go as in-depth as possible. So I met Kira in a laboratory on the 3rd floor of one of the campus buildings. I'd come early, but she was already waiting for me. This was the default location for the proctors. Usually, we didn't spend much time there. We would just set our stuff down and then go follow up on tickets or jobs that were sent out. Our boss, Harry, wasn't there that night. Not like we really needed him anyway. He'd sent out an email beforehand informing us that he was not available, and he'd attached tickets we had to work on. There were 5 or 6 of them, and we had from 4 p.m. to 12 a.m. to finish them up. The first one was to re-image a lab. This meant we would be installing an operating system on each computer in a certain room. The lab was in another building. It was a large campus, and the place we'd need to head over to was about a 6-minute walk. Whenever we went out, we were supposed to take proctor phones with us. They were normal smartphones, the key difference being they had the instructor helpline forwarded to them. It was essential we carry them around to answer any call that might come up. That's why I found it weird Kira didn't take hers. She seemed to forget. So I gave her one and grabbed the other, also taking my laptop with me to update the inventory of the lab. Odd things began to happen when we stopped in the elevator. I punched the button for the ground level, and the doors closed. But before the elevator started, the two of us heard this scratching noise. That's the best way I can describe it. It sounded like an animal, maybe a raccoon, dancing on the roof of the elevator with its nails grazing the metal. I knew for a fact the sound wasn't there when I'd gone up, so I was sure it wasn't the hardware of the elevator. I made a comment about it. Kira seemed indifferent though. In fact, she was awfully quiet. Anyway, the elevator reached the ground level without issue and we got out. The exit was right in front of us then, and we headed through. From there, we started our walk to the building that housed the lab. The sun had already begun to set. It was the middle of winter, after all, and it was chilly. After another few minutes, we got to the building. The doors were automatically locked at 4 p.m. each day, so we needed to swipe our access cards to get in. Despite the smart security on the door, this building was a lot older than the others. The air conditioning seemed defective. It was incredibly hot and muggy when we entered. The lab in question was on the bottom floor of the building, so we took the stairs to get down. Once we made it to the lower level, we were greeted with a hallway. It was dark and rather ominous. Even worse, the lights were buggy. Only the one directly above our heads came on. The rest in the hallway started to flicker. Almost all of them were spotty and inconsistent, except for the one at the very end, which didn't turn on at all. We didn't mind terribly though. There was enough light to make out the room designations. The lab we were looking for was right in the middle of the hallway. We walked up to it, and Kira swiped her card to open it up. Only nothing happened. The card didn't seem to trigger the reader at all. It didn't spit an error, it just ignored it. So I swiped mine, and the door opened up. As we got into the room, we noticed something bizarre. One of the computer chairs, the one at the far corner of the room, was spinning. Quickly, too. It was like someone had just slammed it as hard as they could. No one else was there, though. Even weirder, inertia should have slowed down the chair, but it just kept spinning, like its velocity was continuously being refreshed. We both looked at each other, then I went over to it, freaked out but trying not to show it. I grabbed the chair to stop it from spinning. It froze, but as it did, this sensation of ice crept over me. It was like when you swim in a pool in the middle of winter, then get out and feel the exposure on your skin. Only it was just on my arm. I must have freaked out a little, cause Kira asked me if I was okay. I said I was fine, and then the sensation went away. Like there one second, gone the next. After I recovered, I was going to make a comment about the chair, but she had already gotten to work, so I didn't bother, instead following her lead. It seemed to me she was having a rough night, because she fumbled with the keyboards, apparently forgetting how to open up the boot menu. So I took over her machines for her. It wasn't hard work after all. She sat down and watched me, looking very tired. It took about 15 minutes to begin the imaging process on all the computers. I read over the next ticket. It involved pulling up a workstation in a different lab back to the proctor room to diagnose it, because it had some hardware issues. I checked with Kira to make sure she was okay staying in the lab by herself. She didn't have a problem with it, so I left. I did feel uneasy about her being alone, though. I didn't really know why. Something bothered me about it, but I knew it would be redundant for both of us to wait there. So off I went. As soon as I stepped into the hallway and shut the lab door, the scratching sound returned. It was right over my head then, in the ceiling. The exact same sound from the elevator in the other building. I could hear it more clearly without the noise of the cables moving up and down. It sounded less like a raccoon and more like a dog. There was some weight to whatever creature was making the noise. It seemed to be digging, furiously, as if it was trying to get through the ceiling. I tried to ignore it and headed down the hallway, but the sound followed me. Every fluorescent light I passed turned off, like whatever was making that sound up there was cutting the wires. Paranoid, I sped up and eventually reached the end of the hallway. The noise followed, and quickly it cut off the very last light. Freaked out and a little frustrated, I yelled something along the lines of, "Enough!" And just like that, the noise went away, as if it was never there. I was really anxious at that point. I think I tried to rationalize it as I passed living between levels of the building. Just as I was about to take the stairs up to the ground level, though, I remembered Kira. My stomach dropped as I thought of her. It was the same feeling of uneasiness. Not necessarily for her safety either, I just felt strange. It's hard to explain, but anyway, I ran back down the dark hall and opened the lab door to check on her. To my dismay, she was gone. The chair she had been sitting in just before was empty, but now it was spinning rapidly just like the one from the first time we entered the room. I didn't know what to do. I was beyond freaked out. I spun around, pale as a ghost, when I heard the door to the lab unlock. Lo and behold, it was Kira. She was fine, apparently, even smiling, unlike when I had saw her previously. Then she asked me a confusing question. "Hey, why didn't you wait for me?" I blinked, confused. She told me that she had arrived in the proctor room to find it empty, with me and the phones already gone. She had to look up the first ticket to find out where I was, and then she came and found me. I just sort of stared. I must have given her this look because she was like, "What's wrong?" Then I explained to her that I had met her earlier that shift, and we headed to the lab together. She looked at me like I was stupid. She iterated again that she had been late and had to look up the room to find out where to go. I think I snapped then. I said something along the lines of, "If this is a joke, it's not funny." She asked me what I was talking about. That's when another realization set in. When you're in some freaky situation like this, you don't sweat the small stuff. You don't take in every detail. So I only realized then that Kira was wearing something totally different than what I'd seen her in before. There were two possibilities. Either this was some elaborate prank where she left, changed, and came back, all the while messing with the lights. Or there was something really bad going on. That's when I decided to check. I told her that she had taken the proctor phone and she insisted she hadn't, saying both phones were gone by the time she'd gotten there. So I took out my own phone and called the number of the proctor phone she had, fully expecting it to ring from her pocket. But it didn't. The dial tones played, but the device itself must have been too far, because we didn't hear it anywhere. Kira looked at me, annoyed, and I was about to apologize for accusing her of lying before I was cut off. Someone answered on the other side of my call. I heard nothing at first, but the dial tones had stopped, and it didn't reach voicemail, so I knew someone had picked up. Immediately, I put the phone into speaker, mouthing the word, "Listen," to her. We both stood there silently. As I turned the volume to max, we picked up on a noise. It sounded like breathing, faint but audible. Someone absolutely was there. Kira, who wasn't half as freaked out as I was, decided to say something. "Hello?" Immediately after she spoke, the breathing stopped, only to be replaced seconds later by this heaving, like laughing but dry, almost silent, the only noise coming from the diaphragm changing shape. It went on for 15 seconds. We both listened, wide-eyed, before the call dropped without warning. The other person had hung up. Kira took the phone from my hand and called back more than once, but whoever or whatever it was did not answer again. I wish I could say it ended there. I want to tell you we decided to pack it up, call it a night, and leave after that, but we didn't. Kira was headstrong, convinced it was some prankster messing with us, and I, scared as I was, wasn't going to leave her alone. So we kept working. Maybe 2 hours later, we finished up the first ticket in the lab, finalizing every install, then moved on to the second, hauling a computer back to the proctor room. Everything was good for a while. After we got the machine in the door, Kira said she was going to use the restroom. It was only a few doors down, so I didn't raise an issue. I nodded at her, moving the computer into the room to hook it up to a monitor and begin diagnosing what was wrong. When I got to the desk, though, I jumped. On the table was the missing proctor phone, the one that we had called. It was just sitting there in its usual basket. I know for a fact only me and Kira were on duty. No one else should have had access to that room, and she hadn't left my sight until we got there. So how in the world was it here? Suddenly, the door to the room slammed. I'd left it open so she wouldn't have to swipe to get in, and it slammed hard. I knew someone had pushed it. Now focused less on fear and more on my coworker's safety, I got up, running over to the door and yanking it open. I was met with the dark hallway, like totally dark. The overhead lights that were up 24/7 were all offline. The only reason I could see at all was because of streetlights seeping into the mini glass panels of the building. Focusing, I turned my phone's flashlight on. It was pitiful in the huge college hallways, but it made them walkable. I called Kira's name. There was no response, so I began walking to the restrooms. On my way, I passed by a classroom and the door creaked open as I walked. It was so eerie, slow and drawn out, like a horror film. I found it impossible that a door like that could have been so terribly lubricated. Regardless, I continued on. The washroom was just up ahead. I used my phone to identify which of the doors were for women. It was held open by a door stopper, so I entered. I called Kira's name again. Still, no reply. I felt a little weird about going into a female bathroom, but given the circumstances, I really had no other choice. Shining my light around the room revealed no one. It was small. I could see almost every corner, and Kira was not there. The only thing amiss about the room was the stall door. It was swinging back and forth, making no noise at all. Just like the chairs from before, it showed no sign of slowing down. I remember being mesmerized by it, standing still to watch it glide. I was snapped back into reality from the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Immediately, I shot back out, calling for Kira again. By the time I'd exited the restroom, the footsteps were already down the corridor and behind a corner. It sounded like the other person, whoever it was running. So I ran after them. It was like something from a cartoon. No matter how fast I ran, they always stayed a little ahead of me. I could never quite reach the person, but I was always close enough to follow. I was led up and down stairs, down all sorts of different hallways until finally, it stopped. I was huffing and puffing as I turned past the last corner. There was only one door there, and it was ajar. I recognized it as one of the School of Health classrooms. I caught my breath, now irritated that I'd been led around the school. Then I walked up, shouldering the door open. The room was entirely dark. I reached over for the manual light control, flicking it up. It was able to override whatever had kept the hallway lights off, and it turned on, illuminating the room. Oh man, I wish I didn't flick the light switch on. There were skeletons. I don't mean real skeletons. It's one of those models you've probably seen in science classrooms. About the same size as a human one, but made out of plastic or some composite material. Anyway, in every single chair sat a model skeleton. They were all turned to face me. It was horrifying. Who the heck had set up all these, and when? As I took a step backward from them, there was an ear-splitting noise. I blinked, and every jaw fell off the skeletons in unison, clacking to the floor, like they were all severed off. There I was being stared down by an army of jawless model skeletons. Right away, I noped out of there. As I ran, I could have sworn I heard plastic joints cracking as if they were pursuing me. I took the nearest exit, pushing out of the building into the cold night air. I remember taking a minute to catch my breath and process what the heck had just happened. I wanted to run, so badly I wanted to run, but Kira was still in there somewhere. She wasn't picking up her phone. I even called our boss Harry, but he didn't respond either. At that point, I was fed up. I think I was going to call the police, but was trying to work out how to get across my story without sounding insane. Then, something caught my attention. I could see a shape moving, but not very quickly. It was very timid. It was obviously a girl. Kira. Even in the low light, I knew it was her because of the short crop of her hair. She walked out of the shadow and onto the path. It was so weird. 10 feet away, she faced away from me, dead center in the middle of the walkway. I remember calling out to her. I wasn't thinking. If I was thinking, I would have known something wasn't quite right. But I was too worried about her and too glad to see her again to be careful. I said her name, and then she started heaving. Facing away from me, she was doing this convulsive motion, like she was hysterically laughing. Only there was absolutely no sound coming from her, none. It went on for minutes, the same horrifying movement. I backed up, slowly to the door I'd exited from, automatically swiping my door and pushing on through. When I turned back only a few seconds later, she, if you can call it that, because it obviously wasn't Kira, had disappeared from the path. As soon as she was gone from my view, the lights turned back on. The entryway of the building was illuminated once more, as were all the hallways. I could move about again without my phone's flashlight. Very carefully, I headed upstairs as quiet as I could, then to the proctor room. My plan was to grab my stuff and book it out of the building, calling the police on my way. Quickly, I swiped the card and shouldered my way into where my backpack was. Kira was waiting for me. She had the computer we'd brought up on a table with its side panel off. She was busy working on it. She didn't even turn her head to me, only saying something like, "Oh, hey." I was so glad to see her, the real her, that I ran up and hugged her. She asked what the heck I was doing, and I told her I'd gone searching for her when the lights shut off. Before I could ramble about the person running through the halls and the model skeletons, and the other version of her that was doing that heaving thing, she cut me off. She told me that when the lights shut off, she left the bathroom and came back to the proctor office to find me. Apparently, she began working on the computer, and I mumbled something about completing another ticket before I walked out of the room. And after that, despite her protests, I made us pack everything in. We grabbed our things and left, Kira complaining the entire time. I never gave her a real explanation. I couldn't. I just needed to get us both out of there. That's really it. I'm sorry for the length of this story. I wish I could give some detailed explanation or round off with some cliché about seeing a silhouette standing inside one of the buildings as we left. But I can't. It ended as quickly and strangely as it began. The only reason I remembered this story is because Kira hit me up recently. We hadn't seen each other since the beginning of the Rona thing, and she wanted to reconnect. We planned to meet up next weekend to get drinks. In her text, she joked about finding out why I made us leave that night. I thought drafting this up might help me find the words to explain it to her, if I decide to explain it at all. As for what entity or phenomenon was in motion that night, I haven't a clue. Maybe someone out there does know, though, and will heed my story as a warning. I do know that whatever it was sincerely enjoyed freaking me out, though. Take that how you will. Good luck on your night shifts, everyone, and stay safe. Haunted and Unwanted at Walmart, from KronicAvenger. When I was about 20 to 21 years old, I used to work at Walmart as janitorial and maintenance overnight. The job included usual cleaning and overnight cart gathering. Now, a few bizarre things happened to us. Products falling off of shelves, disembodied voices, etc. But there were 3 very unusual occurrences. The first one happened on a New Year's night. We had a guy go running through our store while being chased by police officers. In the midst of this, me and 2 other coworkers were in the back room doing our usual work, when suddenly gunshots were fired towards us. Luckily, we were just fine. More terrifying was the man who was screaming threats at all of us. Another major experience was when we would go out to collect carts. We weren't allowed to be out there alone, we'd have to have 2 or more people at least. Well, I went out and was told that my buddy there would be outside soon. Within 5 minutes, a person pulled up in a Jeep and he looked like he had been doing substances. He tried to lure me over to his car. Of course, I never went near him, and because I refused to go over there, he pulled a pistol on me and aimed it at me. I froze. Slowly, I reached for my walkie-talkie, but then luckily my coworker came out. Then the guy in the car sped away. Lastly, on a Halloween night, my coworker and I were cleaning the bathrooms. Earlier that night, we were hearing a lot of different noises, nothing out of the normal. Now, in the past, there have been people who had killed themselves in our store. I don't have many details on this, but I always believed because of it, our store was extremely haunted. But while cleaning the bathrooms, the lights suddenly flipped off, which was weird, but then I heard my coworker laughing. Maybe it was a joke, I thought. My coworker turned the lights back on, and I looked in the mirror. There, staring back at me, was a black shadow with a yellow-toothed grin. We'd been closed for 2 hours by then, so it couldn't have been a customer. I screamed and ran out of the bathroom. But since that day, I would occasionally see shadows out of the corners of my eyes. Not too often, though. I'm happy to say that I never saw whatever that was, ever again. A Sleepover with a Predator. From Sigh. The memory of that stormy night still sends chills up my spine to this day. It goes to show that you can't trust anyone, no matter how much you think you know them. I was 21 years old at the time, and I had just graduated from Bible college. I moved up to my first job as a youth pastor in rural Indiana. It was a very small town. There was a gas station, a small coffee shop, a school, a good-sized park, and the small church I just landed a job at. Things were tough at first, because I'm originally from the southeast, and now I lived hundreds of miles away in a place where I knew absolutely no one. That was until I met him. His name was Ray, and we hit it off quick. He was in charge of the elementary school kids at the church, and I primarily worked with the teenagers. Since we were both considered to be in the youth department, we'd often find ourselves having lunch meetings, going on walks after work to talk about life, and would watch TV shows at each other's houses. There was one night Ray slept over at my house to watch a movie with me, and I was a bit grossed out to see him come out of my bathroom after changing into his PJs, which turned out to be nothing but tighty-whities. At first I was glad to have a friend, but after a while I felt more and more uncomfortable with Ray. The first thing that would make someone uneasy was Ray's appearance. He was very tall. He stood about 6'6", and he had very long, slender arms and legs, but his torso was very heavy. He was kinda similar to those cartoon frogs in the old Looney Tunes cartoons. His face was a little chubby, nearly bald, and he had glasses. You'd think a guy that was this big would have a deep voice, but it couldn't be farther from the truth. Rather, he had a very high-pitched voice and spoke to me and others like a mother would speak to a small child. Ray also had a lot of tics, where he would randomly convulse his head and shoulders, and he would stick out his seemingly 7-inch long tongue whenever he'd have those random muscle spasms. I ignored all this, because I've always tried to be one to judge people for their character, not their physical appearance. Plus, Ray helped me move in and assisted me in painting my new place, so I felt bad for judging a guy like that. But it was disturbing nonetheless. Even though his appearance and tics made me feel weird, it was his weird obsession with me that really made my heart sink. He would constantly ask me to hang out every waking moment. There would be times I would go to the bathroom and come out to find 11 or 12 missed calls from him. Most of the time he reached out, I felt obligated to go, but it was always weird. Whether it was sitting with him and talking for hours while he worked at his mom's cake shop, inviting me to watch lame TV shows instead of manly ones, or interrupting my video game sessions with a call to talk about how much he wanted babies one day, all of these interactions were pushing me away. There was even one time he asked me to go shopping with him, and I told him that I only had time for the one store he suggested, because I had a teen church service that evening. He said, okay, that's fine. After we shopped and got back into his car, he locked the doors and drove me around, laughing and saying, "You're not going anywhere, you're staying with me, everyone loves Ray." After an hour of this maniac driving me around aimlessly and blasting music, I yelled, "Take me back to church." Ray was enraged that I yelled, and he punched me square in the groin. It hurt so bad. I squeaked with whatever voice I had left, "I can't stand you anymore." He was quiet for the rest of the drive back. Ray had driven me around so long that I ended up arriving late to church for my teen service. To make things worse, there were a bunch of angry parents who had been waiting to drop their kids off for nearly 45 minutes. At that moment, I knew I was done. I'd had enough. The next time Ray asked me to do something, I told him I couldn't. I was done with Ray. But he apparently wasn't done with me. He called and texted almost every night with non-stop crying and begging. It was so unnatural sounding for a 27-year-old man. The best way I can describe it is like a middle school girl begging their boyfriend to stay after a breakup. And then the sadness turned to passive aggressiveness when we would see each other at church. There were even times on Sunday morning during the pastor's sermon that I would look over and Ray would be staring at me with this creepy expressionless face. He wasn't listening or paying attention to the message at all. He just sat there glaring at me with this glazed-over look of pain and numbness. But I couldn't help but feel he was fantasizing about something else, something insidious. Eventually, Ray quit his job at the church, got a job as a school teacher, and seemed to make new friends. I thought, finally, Ray has new friends to pester. I was in the clear. It felt as if a huge dark cloud had lifted and the sun shined on me once again. A year passed by. I was now married and had my first child. I'd almost completely forgotten about Ray when, out of the blue, he called me up and asked to catch up. He seemed a lot cooler, like maybe his new teacher friends had really helped him become more normal. We grabbed lunch, and he asked if I wanted to come to his school's football game. I thought, Ray wants to watch football? Finally, something manly. My wife was going to be out of state with our baby visiting family, so I thought, what the heck, and I agreed to go. While we were at the game with his teacher friends, it began to rain shortly into the second quarter. Before we knew it, there was a full-blown thunderstorm with high winds, so the school announced that the game was canceled and sent everyone back to their cars. When Ray and I reached our vehicles, a tornado siren began to blare, and because I lived nearly an hour away, he suggested I come back to his house to seek shelter. Tornadoes in the Midwest are not something to mess around with, so naively, I agreed and followed him home. This turned out to be one of the biggest mistakes in my life. Such a big mistake that I would rather have taken my chances with the tornadoes. I could barely see, and what should have taken 5 minutes took 15 minutes. When we arrived, Ray showed me around his place. The house was a little creepy and ornate looking, with a lot of old dolls and thrift store looking knickknacks. Even though the decor was weird, the evening started off fine. We watched some home improvement shows, had some snacks and some drinks. It was actually a pretty relaxing way to weather the storm, and definitely beat driving 20 miles an hour in heavy rain for several hours, or so I thought. At around 12:30 a.m., the storm was still raging, so we decided to turn in for the night. I asked Ray if I could have a pillow and blanket to sleep on the couch in the living room. He said, no, let's sleep in my room. There's plenty of space in there. But I told him the couch would be more comfortable for me. He kept insisting over and over, so reluctantly, I agreed. The floor in his room was so hard, and all he gave me was this tiny Winnie the Pooh kid's blanket and a flat pillow. I was tossing and turning for what felt like hours. At 2 a.m., Ray's voice spoke in the pitch-black room. You know, you can hop up here in bed with me if you want. There's plenty of room. I said no, firmly, and kept tossing and turning. About 30 minutes later, he asked again, Are you sure? It's really fine. I don't know what came over me, but I was so tired and my back hurt so bad that I hopped into bed. After lying there on my back staring into the darkness, I noticed he kept trying to scoot close to me. I figured he was just asleep, so I inched away a little. This happened several times until I was basically hanging off the bed. He scooted one more time and I turned my back to him. I held really still to act like I was asleep. It got really quiet. Then, out of nowhere, I feel both of his long, skinny arms wrap around me, and he pulls me into his flabby chest. Ray began squeezing me like a python and rubbed his sandpapery cheek on my forehead. I shot out of the bed, somehow breaking free from the grasp of this freak. I grabbed my pillow and blanket, and I lay on the couch after flushing the toilet to play it off like I had to go to the restroom. I was counting down the seconds until the storm ended, so I could make a mad dash to my car and get the heck out of there. My mind was racing as I thought about what the crap just happened in there. I was so repulsed by what Ray did to me, and I felt filthy for even being in the same vicinity of his bed. I lay there on the sofa beside sliding glass doors in the pitch-black living room. There's absolutely zero light except the occasional flash of lightning, and the sound of the downpour and thunder was deafening. This is the moment that still gives me nightmares to this day. As I lay there staring into the pitch blackness, my back facing the window so I could watch towards Ray's room, the lightning flashed, and I about soiled myself, I kid you not. I saw the black silhouette of Ray standing in the doorway. A few minutes passed by. I was frozen like a statue. My heart felt as if it was going to beat out of my chest. I had to act like I was asleep. I couldn't move a muscle. Then the lightning flashed a second time, and I almost passed out to the sight, which I can only describe as a fat, slender man that all of a sudden appeared right above me. My blood ran cold as I held my breath. He bent down with his weird lullaby he was humming. He sniffed my hair and smiled with a little chuckle, then went back to his room, whispering to himself, "I'll see you again." That was the biggest nope in my entire life. As soon as I heard his door shut, I sprang up in an instant, ran down the stairs into the basement, out the back door, and sprinted to my car through the pouring rain. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I felt like he was right behind me, as if his long arms could wrap around me at any moment. As I tried to crank the car, I couldn't get it to start. I fiddled with the keys and locked up steering wheel until I heard the sweet sound of the engine fire up. As I looked up to drive, there he was again, standing in the back doorway like Slender Man. I've never driven so fast in the rain in my life. My wife and I have moved away to work at a larger church in the city, and things have been a lot less eventful, thank goodness. Ray tried to call several times before we moved away, but I never answered. Eventually, the calls and the texts stopped, and I've never spoken to Ray again. I don't know why I was so naive. I guess I just always tried to see the best in people. But I can't help but wonder what Ray would have done to me if I really did fall asleep in his bed. Was that what he was thinking about as he stared at me in church those days before he left? It just goes to show that you can never trust someone, even if you think you understand them fully. Be careful out there and watch out for predators, because they come from places you'd least expect. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at eriecast.com.